Welcome to today's episode of Sports Scandals, where I document and narrate the stories about your favorite sports figures of all time from yesteryear and the biggest rumors and scandals about them that y'all may have never heard of, before social media. I don't know if all of these scandals and rumors are true. I'm just putting the stories out in the air so that everybody can know about them. On our 5th episode, we got the Raging Bull himself, Jake Lamotta. Let's do it.
I'm off ahead, so I guess I'm labeled a headhunter. Throw me on the verse and I promise you'll probably last longer. Moving through the masses, I'm crashing the main circuit. Too bad cause I had the plans to be modest, remain closer.
Jake LaMotta was born in New York City, July 10, 1922 to Joan Elizabeth LaMotta. His family was dirt poor growing up. So poor that Jake could always hear big rats inside the walls at night, running into things and squealing loudly. When he was around 6 years old, his family moved to Philadelphia in search of better work for his father, but things got really bad for Jake at school. He was constantly bullied and beat up by kids, and he would always get his lunch stolen. One day, he was complaining to his mom about being bullied, and his father slapped him, gave him an ice pick, and told him to not come home again without kicking their butts. Jake says that this was the best lesson he had ever received from his father, seeing that he was abused repeatedly by him. One time at school, 3 kids came up to him trying to beat him up, and he slashed one of the kids across the face with an ice pick. Ever since that day, the powerful feeling he got from doing that stuck with him, and no one would ever try him like that ever again. Him and his father never had a great relationship, especially given the fact that he would beat his mother and him and his siblings all the time. He even bought his dad a house when he was a prize fighter, but whenever he would ask his father for a favor, his father would always tell him no. And by his own estimates, he had been in 1,000 fights before he even hit the amateur ranks in boxing. But after he learned how to fight growing up, he turned to learning how to steal and became a master at that too. School was a complete afterthought for him, as it was for most kids in his neighborhood growing up. They wanted to steal and graduate to being in the mafia, per Jake. Jake had an attitude like a hair trigger. I mean, the smallest of things would make him blow up, and he did not care if you were going to kill him because he would kill you first. He was an angry, misguided kid, and he struggled with his anger issues throughout his entire life. He didn't even get past the 10th grade and turned to robbing stores and people full time. But y'all know what we here for, baby. Let's do it. When Jake was just 16, there was a local bookie named Harry Gordon who always carried home a good grip of money from bookkeeping. Jake plotted on this guy for some time, months actually, scoping out his route home and all. After finally mustering up the courage to do the mugging, Jake took a lead pipe and buzzed Gordon in the back of the head. Gordon staggers and stays on his feet, and Jake, enraged, beats him to a bloody pulp. He beat him so bad that the hospital thought that Harry was dead. Hell, even the newspapers printed up that he was dead. Well, fast forward 10 years later, after his defeat of Marcel Cerdan, a man with scars on his forehead comes over to Jake and asks if he remembers him. Jake thought he had seen a ghost. Well, Harry never found out that it was Jake who did that to him, even on his deathbed. He never uttered a single word about it to the guy, and he was never caught by the cops for the incident. Instead, he ended up getting arrested for other things, such as attempted robberies, possession of burglars' tools, assaults, and breaking and entering. He ended up spending time at a reform school in New York for a jewelry store heist, with the judge giving him 1 to 3 year sentence. The bottom line is, if something didn't change soon, he was destined for a life of crime. His father used to force him to go to social clubs in the Bronx that used to host fight nights with kids ever since he was 8 years old. And all of the money that Jake would make, though not much, his father would just take it from him. As you can see so far in this video, his relationship with his dad, Joe, was never a positive one, and it lends itself to much of the reason for him growing up into the man that he did. While in the detention center, he was able to get into working at the boxing gym at the jail after he tried to escape in a truck during his first few days there. A priest came to speak with him and offered to help him, so he did. This is where Jake first learned to hit the punching bags and jumping rope. Once he got out of the detention center, he decided to go pro, much to the disgust of his best friend Pete, who wanted him to go back to robbing and stealing with him. Oh, but wait. We got some more scandal for you before we move on. Let's talk about it. He and his best friend Pete the girl when they were teens. Basically, they were in a car with some girls, right? Well, Pete had one of the girls and penetrated her against her wishes. Once Jake saw that, his mouth dropped wide open and he climbed in the back seat, forced himself upon the same girl after she said no, and enough is enough, over and over again. He shoved his hat in her face to shut her up, got her in a lock, and took advantage of her. You know why he said he did it? Because women are only good for one thing. This was the 1930s, so had this had happened decades later, Mr. Lamotta would have been in heaps of trouble. I'm telling you, the lack of social media saved a ton of these guys. But let's get back to the story. Jake started making his mark immediately on the amateur circuit by winning a diamond belt. One thing about boxing, especially back during that time, is that the mob is known to have had their hands deep in the pockets and corrupted the sport. It was no different for Jake, as he would get into shootouts, he would get threatened, and he would be corrupted throughout his life and career by the mob. And Jake was also married 7 times. 7. And every last one of his marriages were toxic and filled with violence of some sort. In his first marriage at the age of 20 in 1942, that one lasted only a year. There was one time at a party where he was blacked out drunk with his wife there, and she got upset with him for trying to make a pass at a woman. Apparently, he hit her so hard that she was knocked out and everyone thought that she was dead. And after so many attempts to wake her up, he and his brother decided that they should just toss her body in the river. The man was a straight up lunatic. They had a full-blown plan just to roll her up in the rug and take her out back, but luckily Pete, his best friend, ended up showing up and told them to just call the doctor and tell them that she had too much alcohol in her system and fell down the steps. And thankfully, once she got to the doctor, she ended up not being dead. On September of 1942, he had his first big bout against the man who is widely considered to be the greatest of all time by many, Sugar Ray Robinson, the first of 6 fights. He lost that first fight, but in the second fight a year later, he got the best of Sugar Ray, being the first person to ever knock him down. Robinson went on to beat him in the remainder of the 6 fights, becoming one of the greatest boxing robberies of all time. After his second fight with Sugar, everyone was calling for Jake to fight for the championship, but there was one problem, and that problem was huge. The mob controlled boxing. Ever since he was a kid, Jake did everything he could to stay away from them, and they absolutely despised him for it. Since he wouldn't take on the mafia guy as his manager, they didn't give him a shot at the title. But before we continue, let's talk about just how sick this man was. When I tell you that this man was a sociopath, I truly mean it in every sense of the word, and he'd tell you that himself. So, get this, his best friend Pete ended up doing the bid in prison, right? Pete ended up writing him a letter saying that he missed him and knows all about the Robinson fight and so on and so forth. Well, Pete's girlfriend Viola brought Jake over to help him write a letter back to Pete because Jake was illiterate. But Lamotta just couldn't stop staring at Viola in her dress. Next thing you knew, he tells her that Jake wants me to take care of you and that it is all fine if we do something. She told him no repeatedly. This man decided to pick her up, threw her on the bed. By the way, she told him that she was a virgin and not even Pete had done anything with her, but that's besides the point, and forced himself inside of her while she's crying and telling him to stop. Eventually, he noticed blood and realized she was not lying about being a virgin, and that was the only reason he felt bad for what he did. He ran out of the apartment, got in his car, and drove around aimlessly. He felt extremely terrible. I mean, the guy assaulted his best friend's love. This is crazy as hell. Then in 1943, he meets his second of 7 wives, the woman he was with the longest, Vicky. Vicky was considered to be a very beautiful woman, a model, a Playboy bunny, and their marriage was the epitome of hell. Hell, but more on that to come. Pete ends up coming home from prison, and of course, the first person he goes to see is Jake. They hit it off like they always did. One day, they went to a place called Richie's that they always go to, and they spotted Viola, Peter's old girl, and the one Jake took advantage of. She had completely gone off the deep end after the situation with Jake, and all of the men in the bar were talking about her and how she was always hot in the pants. And Jake knew that this was his doing. But anyway, Viola finally spotted Pete, surprised that he was back home, and when Pete tried to reach out for her and hug her, she pushed him off and walked to her car, drunk out of her mind. She muttered something under her breath about Jake, but Pete did not hear her. She had become known as the girl who slept with everyone and got around. Weirdly enough, that same night, one of his old mafia buddies set him up on a double date. And guess whose Pete date was? You guessed it, Vicky Lamotta. Yes, Jake's wife. Pete went absolutely berserk on the mob guy, yanked Vicky and took her home, disgusted about the entire situation with her. Pete asked her why she was out cheating on Jake, and she told him because he uses me as a punching bag whenever he wants, and he doesn't tend to her needs as a woman, outside of sex. Well, the mob really dug deep into Jake about the fact that he refused to have a boss over him, managing him, corrupting fights and whatnot. It was a slap in the face to them, an embarrassment. Jake was the only guy in boxing who had a top tier name who wanted nothing to do with that life. They tried everything, bribing his best friends to convince him, showing up at his massage therapy sessions, working through his wife, the whole nine. One time, one of the mob guys who constantly bothered Jake, named Salvi, showed up at the massage parlor trying to get him to flip, as usual. When he walked out the door, he mentioned Vicky and how Pete was always over there with her whenever Jake was out of town fighting. And he knew that would send Jake into a rage, so he sped home to his wife and immediately saw a chewed up toothpick on the floor when he walked in. He knew that toothpick was from Salvi, and that Salvi had just been there. So in true Raging Bull fashion, after she admitted that Salvi was just there to sell her a mink coat, he slapped her over and over again and she ran into the room and locked the door. Jake barged in with his shoulder, threatening to kill her, but she was out the window and drove off by the time he got the door open. Just an extremely toxic marriage from day one. He jumped in his car going after her, weaving in and out of traffic, and he caught up to her car. He knew that she was heading to Pete's house for protection, so he immediately went there and saw her car there. He ran into the building where they were, saw Pete consoling her, and started beating Pete to a bloody pulp, almost killing him. Vicky told him that Pete had only been to the house twice, once to check on their sick child and once to stop her from cheating on Jake. That was it. Jake felt terrible again, ran out to his car, and sped home. He didn't talk to Pete for another 10 years after that. Let's pump the brakes. We got a serious allegation to discuss. Let's fast forward a bit to 1947. The mob finally got to Lamotta by putting him up against a young, up-and-coming light heavyweight boxer, Billy Fox. They wanted him to throw the fight in order for him to get a chance at the championship, and that's exactly what he did. He had fought off the mob for 4 long years, and he felt that he could do it no more. He yearned to be a champion because he felt that it would make everything in his life go a lot better. Here's the problem though, besides just flat out throwing the fight, he did a terrible job at it. I mean, quite literally, everyone knew what was happening. The fans in the stands, the critics, the janitorial crew, everybody. It was plainly obvious what was going on, and it turned out to be one of the biggest stains on the sport of boxing to this day. What ended up saving him when the boxing commission came through with their investigation was his doctor. See, Jake had ruptured his spleen before the fight, and his doctor told him that he must be on bed rest. He ended up being fined $1,000 and a suspension of 7 months, but nothing serious came of it due to the testimony from his doctor. But what he could not escape was the public. Everyone completely turned on him, and he suffered through it for the next few months. Nevertheless, after serving out his suspension and winning a few tune-up fights, he finally got his opportunity at the championship against the French fighter Marcel Cerdan. Jake ended up winning the fight and became the middleweight champion. In 1954, after an illustrious fighting career, Lamotta called it quits, and he and Vicky moved to Miami Beach for retirement. And of course, like so many other greats, when he retired, his drinking and sleeping around went to another level. Jake ended up buying a saloon in Miami where everyone in town would come to visit. He dated a plethora of movie starlets during this time. We're talking about the names such as Jane Mansfield, Ginger Rogers, Jane Russell, and Heidi Lamar, just to name a few. Weirdly enough, he never had sex with any of them because of his mouth. Then one day, Vicky comes into a saloon and he had his arm around like 5 women, and she pulls him aside in private and tells him that she is getting a divorce and he has been court ordered not to return to the home. Why? Because he was the talk of the town and how he was sleeping with every woman in sight. The women would even come to her and tell her about them sleeping with him. So, in 1957, he gets divorced, and things take a turn for the worse for Jake. So let's talk about it. In 1958, he was arrested for prostituting a 14-year-old girl inside his club. The story states that he introduced the girl to 2 different men on 2 different occasions, and she was paid $20 for each incident. Jake says that it isn't what happened and that all he did was introduce the girl to some men without knowing that they would engage in sexual activities with the girl. The girl's father actually had been her handler at first and was even sent to prison for incest. Then, once he got tired of her, he sold her to a madam to manage her. It's a really sick story all around, to be honest with you. Jake proclaims his innocence till the day that he died, but I'll let y'all be the judge of this. I'm just telling the story. He ended up being convicted for operating a place for lewdness and prostitution and was sentenced to 6 months. Following his release from prison, Jake got married a third time, which didn't last long either, and started to get into movies and TV shows. He was immortalized in a 1980 film, Raging Bull, by Martin Scorsese, which honestly made him look like a saint compared to his real, true story. He met back up with his old buddy Pete after 10 years, and Pete joined him in his acting stardom. Lamotta got married 4 more times, all subsequently ending for the same reason as before, except for the last marriage he was in at the age of 90 years old. On September 19, 2017, Jake LaMotta passed away at 95 years old from complications with pneumonia. He was a raging bull to the end. And that concludes our story on the late, great Jake LaMotta. Thank you guys for tuning in. Please do not forget to subscribe, like, and share my content to as many people as possible. I'm trying to grow my platform, and I greatly appreciate you guys for all of the support you've given me. The sixth episode will be out soon, and until next time, you guys be easy. Holla.
I'm off ahead, so I guess I'm labeled a headhunter. Throw me on the verse and I promise you'll probably last longer. Moving through the masses, I'm crashing the main circuit. Too bad cause I had the plans to be modest, remain close.